3 years ago, I decided to make a change. Around September of 2019, I decided I didn't want to just play and consume games anymore. I wanted to be a part of them. I wanted to make them, but for real this time. At the time, I was working in retail after completing an IT degree. I desperately wanted to get into the industry of my field, so I needed something to show for it. A little project for my portfolio and put the beginner level programming skills I had learned to practice. Throw a little pandemic and a new baby in there too, and this all led to a project that I originally thought would take a couple of months, but ended up being something I'm still working on 3 years later, called Foot Joust. So one day, I just decided out of the blue I was going to make something, unlike all those other times that I said that. So I did a quick Google search and randomly selected an engine, then found this tutorial, and within a couple of hours I made something called Banana Jump. But I couldn't do anything with this like distribute it or put it on the App Store because it wasn't my game. I had to start planning my own. I wanted to stick to mobile because I liked the idea of having something in my pocket I could pull out and show off. This would also help me keep the game design a lot more basic as a beginner. So I got designing and came up with the first thing I could think of. On September the 18th, 2019, I opened up a little text document and wrote down some ideas. I wanted to make a side-scrolling game similar to Flappy Bird, but with a knight character focusing on combat. The combat would somehow be focused on stances using low, mid, and high attacks. The player would have armor for health for each low, mid, and high attack they receive. There was originally meant to be color-based magic, but that was never added. Then the player would get points based on how far they traveled and how many enemies they defeated. Next, I used my high-level artistic skills to draw up this concept. Originally on the right, there were going to be buttons for each direction of attack, high, mid, and low. And then on the left, the buttons would be for the magic spells, with all the score-based stuff at the bottom. With all the design plans done, I got to work. For most of it was just me figuring out how to get the player to endlessly move across and create a parallaxing background. I eventually ended up with something like this screenshot. Unfortunately, I do not have any builds or footage from this time, but I quickly drew up these background pieces and found this animated character model to use as the player and the enemy. At this point in time, the player would only be able to move across the screen towards the enemy and either crash into each other, or if the player swipes at the correct time, the enemy would disappear. Which means I got rid of the idea of buttons and decided to make the player have to swipe in the direction they needed. Then, after a couple of weeks of this, I just stopped until early next year.
Right now, we have a window of opportunity to break the chain of community transmission, to contain the virus, to stop it multiplying, and to protect New Zealanders from the worst. Our plan is simple. We can stop the spread by staying at home and reducing contact.
On the 25th of March 2020, the entirety of New Zealand went into lockdown due to the looming threat of the pandemic. I was stuck at home for over 4 weeks with nothing but spare time, so I made a decision to pick up game development again, but this time permanently. Although before I could do that, I needed art assets, but I wanted to create my own. The only problem was I couldn't draw, so I started following this pixel art tutorial new to me. Then, using my new skills, I created the first character model and then changed the color to black to be the enemy. From then on, I continued working on the game, figuring out how to make the combat system, creating a main menu, and the backgrounds. This build I'm currently playing is from the 30th of June, just a couple of months after coming out of lockdown. As you can see, I have an older version of the background in mountains. This settings button down here doesn't work yet. I hadn't made a good logo yet. The how to play section was just a big block of text that was hard to follow. I originally created this progress screen, which I've now ditched, and these were all the enemies I had so far. None of the stuff on the left actually worked yet either. Now when I start the game, music only plays during gameplay, which is now the song that's used in the main menu. The UI in the bottom left is a lot more simple and doesn't function, and we're only a hint of what was to come. When the player dies, they just stop and they have to just hit the restart button. The combat and the swiping was a lot harder and felt clunkier. And you could also see the parallax background popping into place on the right when it changes. Development continued after this, just very slowly, as most of it was learning Unity and how to improve the systems I'd created and sending out test builds to friends. But the most important thing I worked on was the timing of the combat. Most of my friends who played the game found it too hard to get the timing of the combat, so I worked on one significant change. Before, when a player would swipe to attack, the code to execute the attack would not run until the player has released their finger from the screen, which would cause a large delay. The player could also hold down and wind up their attacks. So instead, I calculated the attack to trigger when the player had moved their thumb just the slightest amount, making the attacks faster and more instant. By this point, I had invested a lot more time into this game than I'd expected. I also started to get more invested into the game dev community online, watching hours of other game devs' devlogs, being inspired by what others were doing, and I thought it was best to start my own videos in an attempt to share what I've been working on and try to get potential players and help encourage others to get into game dev. So on the 17th of September 2020, I uploaded my first video explaining the game development so far and the combat system. For the rest of the year, I uploaded videos almost weekly on the game's development. As I started to close in on the end of the year, I managed to add the tutorial section, the system for displaying the player's rewards at the end of a run, planned out how I would monetize the game, incorporated the crates that would soon spew out loot, and created a basic shop system. By the end of the year, I was feeling pretty accomplished, but I didn't have much to show as a game developer. It also needed a small break and something smaller and quicker to release. So in a couple of weeks, I made a mobile fighter spin-off called Foot Joust Arena and released it on the Play Store. And then somewhere in those couple of weeks, my first child was born in December. With a completely new change to my life and new set of responsibilities, I had to dial things back a bit. Videos ended up releasing monthly instead of weekly, and I had to plan more carefully around when I would work on the game. After spending some time doing basic polish and bug fixes, I decided it was time to enter my first game jam, the Blackthorn Prod Game Jam. I made a game called Deathmage, a top-down shooter where the less health you have, the stronger your attacks are. It didn't turn out great and I barely finished it in time, but I'm still glad I entered and had another game under my belt. After that, I got back to working on Foot Joust again, with a goal in mind, working towards a demo for people to actually play. Next on my list of things to do was to upgrade the shop system to include all the crates that the player could buy. What was good about the new shop system was that it was more dynamic. This was a big learning point for me. Instead of the buttons being placed here manually like before with the enemies, I created a class and series of arrays where I could fill in info about shop items in a database and have the system create each button manually and fill in all the information. I'd also prepared the system for power-ups that I would soon create. The player has also an inventory that would fill in this box here using the same dynamic system. Then shortly after that, I made a special game mode where you would only break open crates that the player bought to try and acquire loot. Next, I designed what power-ups would be in the game and what their symbols look like, which would then be available for purchase in the shop, but not acquired from crates or usable in-game just yet. A proper save system was also incorporated. Then I started to work on the next major system, the upgrade menu called the Forge. I had always planned for the player to be able to take more hits since the very beginning. Now using resources gathered from bosses, they can choose to upgrade each piece of armor that corresponds to where they can get hit, including how many times the player can revive in a game's run. And around this point, I had crossed into the second half of the year. So in about July, I started to get ready for the first ever demo with a bit of polish and one last major system update. The enemy selection works by the player selecting whatever enemies or items they want to appear in a run. But to keep the players from just choosing crates or the best enemies, I created a weighted point system where the player has to fill in the requirements until this bar turns green. Then, at the start of August, I released the first demo, to not much attention at all, which was no surprise at all, but still kind of disappointing. I had a few comments and feedback from Reddit and was lucky enough to have some people play it on a stream. But I was starting to feel down on myself. I had little reach to any kind of community. I didn't know anyone in real life around me who was interested in game development, and my channel wasn't growing. I had viewers and got comments regularly, but it was still pretty quiet. I felt mostly lonely and isolated from other game developers. I tried to use Twitter in the past, but didn't have much luck with it. But I thought I'd give it another crack. But I'm glad I did, because it would turn into the best sprint in my game dev journey yet. When I started using Twitter, I took note of some of the other game devs and started having a few interactions with them, and then noticed everyone was trying something called the 100 Days of Game Dev Challenge, where every day for 100 days straight, you do one little bit of game dev. I thought it was the perfect way to keep me motivated. Also, another lockdown happened in there somewhere, but I no longer work in retail, so I had to do my new job from home. I started the 100 Days of Game Dev Challenge on the 25th of August and ended on the 8th of December. And in that time, regarding Foot Joust, I created 2 new bosses, the second map for the game, a whole new roster of enemies, and started adding working power-ups to the game. I also participated in another game jam, the Vim Jam 2, and performed extremely well with the game intern, to the point where I started writing and planning a full release for my next project after Foot Joust. The week after that, I participated in Ludum Dare, making an 8-bit Game Boy replica game. I gained a lot more followers on Twitter and really got more involved with the community with lots of support. I then topped it all off with a video all about the challenge in more detail. After feeling really motivated and extremely accomplished, I then closed off the rest of the year with doing absolutely fuck all for several months. So 2022, that's this year. Well, at least at the time of writing this. To be honest, it's been a really off and on kind of year, but not without a few great accomplishments. After spending most of January and February gaming for once, I didn't really get back into game dev until like the middle of March. I also released significantly less videos. I continued my way through the list of power-ups I had to complete, then failed to finish this top-down shooter for another Ludum Dare, but I had another goal in mind again. The second demo for Footjoust, the beta, which would have all or most of the systems in place, with more maps and enemies. After completing most of the power-ups in game, I then also gave them the ability to generate from crates and allow the player to finally equip them. I did some playtesting and created a big list of jobs that had to be done. From the 30th of May to the 2nd of July, I went into crunch mode to complete them all, leading up to the release of the beta. This also included refactoring the entire enemy selection screen to incorporate all the additional changes that had to be made. It was a big job, but it was completely redone from scratch. I also created a lot more sound effects, added a new menu for buying from the shop, and now the ability to sell. And then not long after that, I made my most popular video yet, a 4-minute long, badly made joke about the CEO of Unity that somehow reached 22,000 views. So I think this would take me up to about July. Then everything after that was kind of a blur and uneventful again. At some point earlier in the year, I wrote the entire dialogue script for the story of Intern, and I started to focus on learning and writing music for my games as well. Then, it happened again. The Vim Jam Game Jam was back. Except this time, I got 6th place overall, and I was chosen as one of the judges' picks as a winner for the jam, with my 1-bit survival horror entry, Outlive.
What? Why was there creepy kid noises? You should be ashamed of yourself. That's terrifying.
This was the point where I really felt like I've grown as a game developer. Making that game was a challenge and pushed me further than what I've ever done before, and I just managed to land it correctly. Mainly because I thought it was a smart idea to add a multi-path story that takes into account your actions, and a system that has to reset everything you touch when you die. This could have gone disastrously bad, but it didn't. Running off the massive high of the results of the Vim Jam 3, I tried to get back into developing Footjoust. I already started the 3rd map that I needed to finish, but I'd completely burned out. So from about the middle of October until now, I'd completely stopped all game development together to focus on a few other things, like playing my guitar, my son, and playing God of War Ragnarok and the original God of War trilogy. So where it stands at the moment, the majority of the systems are done for Footjoust. I really just need to create content for it, like maps, music, and enemies. I feel like I'm really closing in on the end of development, but with a lot of work still to do. So because the last 100 Days of Game Dev Challenge worked out so well, I'm going to do it again, but this time it will be 100 days to complete Footjoust, although that doesn't actually include releasing the game. Which also means this will be my last video until the game is completed, so I can stay hyper-focused on just making it. And with all that said, what an incredible journey it's been. I had a lot of fun writing this video and looking back on all my progress over the last 3 years. I know I haven't covered a crazy amount of ground like some others have and only really just stuck to 2D so far, but I feel like I've done a lot for trying to balance game dev life with family life and a full-time job. I now have a few smaller releases under my belt, and my itch page looks more interesting, which makes me proud since my whole life I've always wanted to make games. I talked about it and tried it with friends. There were times when we would say, let's make a game together, and then we would just shrug our shoulders and nothing happened. It hasn't been perfect the whole time. There were a lot of times where I got really burnt out and just stopped, and times where I doubted if I should continue working on Footjoust. I don't think this is a particularly good game, but the ideas that I had for it were interesting and I wanted to see it through to the end. More importantly, because it's teaching me about managing a game on its scope, along with all the pieces and parts that it takes to put together with all the failures and lessons that go along with it. So I guess I never really stopped developing this game in particular because I'm continuing to learn from it still, so I will be really ready for my next big project. Anyways, that's all for now. Thanks to everyone who's watched these videos and everyone on Twitter for all the support so far. If you enjoyed my videos, please let me know and I'll see you next time when the game is actually done.